Greetings and welcome to the Faith and Firearms Project. My name is Michael Chan. At the Faith and Firearms Project, we study the intersection of guns and religion in America. And in the interview today, we have the opportunity to hear from the Reverend Dr. Karyn L. Wiseman. Dr. Wiseman teaches at the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, and she is Associate Professor of Homiletics and the Director of United Methodist Studies. I've included a link to her institutional webpage, and then I've also included in the description below that link to her institutional webpage, and then also a link to her blog, which is texaspreacherponderings.blogspot.com. Again, texaspreacherponderings.blogspot.com. Those links are in the description below. I hope you enjoy this fascinating interview. Okay, welcome to the Faith and Firearms Project, and we have the opportunity to talk today with Reverend Dr. Karyn Wiseman of the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, you have a fascinating project going right now that I want to get to really quickly, but an initial question I want to ask, and this is something we talked about in our pre-conversation, is what is your own history with guns? And how did you first encounter them? How has your thinking developed over the years?
Well, I grew up in Texas, and so that culture is very friendly to firearms. I would drive up to school, and there would be pickups parked next to me that had gun racks in them and had rifles in them. For the most part, the gun culture that I was around when I was growing up was a hunting culture. And so there were a lot of folks who were hunting. They were using firearms for that. I knew there were people who probably also had handguns for protection, but that wasn't the major sort of conversation piece that I heard around guns growing up. It was primarily a hunting culture. My dad was a United Methodist pastor who was very much anti-gun. We were raised in a household that didn't have guns. We didn't go to houses that had guns in them that were accessible. My parents would actually make phone calls and say, my kids are coming over to play. Do you have guns in the house? And if they said yes, my parents would literally say, would you lock those up while my kids are there? So he was very vehemently anti-gun. As I grew up, though, I wasn't around a lot of gun violence, that I was aware of until I went to seminary. And I went to seminary at St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas City, Missouri. We were in a very urban environment in Kansas City, Missouri. And I remember hearing gunshots from violence that was going on between gangs and drive-by shootings. It didn't happen all the time, but it happened on a regular enough basis that it really was startling to me. Growing up in Texas, we didn't see that kind of activity. I didn't hear that kind of thing growing up. And it began to really worry me, but I didn't have guns as a part of my life. Didn't want them, didn't want access to them. So that was a huge piece. What began to change was when I moved to Philadelphia with my family. I had a young son, and we heard gunshots again and started talking to Dr. Katie Day, who works in Church and Society at Philadelphia. And she works with a project called Heeding God's Call, which is a gun violence prevention group. They sponsor gun violence Sabbath Sundays. They sponsor picketing at gun shops that are known straw purchase sites where folks come in and illegally purchase multiple guns using someone who is a straw sort of stands in for the gun purchasers who aren't able to buy guns.
Thanks for defining that, by the way. I'm not sure everybody would be familiar with that terminology, straw.
Yes. So it's a really big issue when folks who want to send guns and buy guns are not able to. They pay someone $100 to go in and buy multiple guns at a gun shop using their name, which would clear them from any kind of background checks. And then they take those guns and sell them on the street, use them for gun violence. And so that's a big part of what Heeding God's Call does. And we went to one of the organizational meetings. My family did, and my son was a part of that. My church was involved in it. And my son, who was, I think he was 10 or 11 at the time, really became a very active participant in wanting to be a witness. He was asked to read some names during that event where we were memorializing folks who had been killed by gun violence in Philadelphia. And two of the names he was asked to read were teenagers, were kids that were just barely older than he was. And one of them was a 6-year-old child who was killed in a drive-by. And he began this quest to get us involved, to go and picket at the gun shops. And that became a part of our lives since we've lived in Philadelphia. And that has been a huge part of my development, from someone who sort of knew guns were a part of our culture and sort of didn't really think much about hunting, to someone who really lives in the midst of a gun violence culture and wants to change that. And part of that was my own upbringing. Part of that was my son saying, this is not okay. This is not a part of the culture that I want to be in. And really growing and learning how we could impact the world around us by being a part of Heeding God's Call and other projects in the city that are working to end gun violence.
And Karyn, you are a professor of preaching, is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Okay. From that vantage point, what do you think some of the sources of this violence are? I mean, thinking on a kind of a broader cultural level, you spoke of I think you spoke of a culture of gun violence. What do you think drives that in America today? What's your impression?
Oh, wow. I think there's a number of issues. When you trace back the sort of burgeoning gun violence, I think it is a part of a wider cultural issue that's happening in America today that is dividing us and pushing us to really polar positions politically, economically, structurally in our cultural system. We just have this massive divide that's happening today, and a lot of it is political. It's the religious right and the conservative right versus the progressive liberal left. There is a huge divide in this country about politics. There's a huge divide that is caused by race, that's caused by economic injustice, that's caused by political inequity between those who have and those who don't. There is the use of wedge issues in politics and in election years to drive the fear of the other into the stratosphere. They have used it. Both sides have used it around abortion rights. They've used it around LGBTQ issues. They've used it around Second Amendment rights. They've used it around race. And when that becomes the major way that we have any kind of discourse in this country, is to wedge one group against the other, the fear quotient of the other goes up. And what we know is that when Barack Obama was elected president, gun sales skyrocketed because the NRA and other groups, this is from research and from quantitative data that shows that this occurred, drove this fear that with a Democratic president, now the data also showed that when Bill Clinton was elected, the same kind of wedge issue was used around Second Amendment rights, that a Democratic government was going to take guns away. Folks went out and bought guns by droves, right? We have a permissive sort of environment around violence, unfortunately, in this country, that when we don't get our way, the folks on the extremes use violent methodologies to try to get what they want. And we've seen that in bombings like the Oklahoma bombing. We've seen that in the Boston Marathon bombings. And we've seen it in abortion clinic shootings in the 1980s and 90s when folks were trying to stop that. it's sort of the um, it's the worst case scenario wedge issue that gets placed in our psyche, that if we don't get our way, we have to figure out some way to get our voices heard. And in this environment, it's really hard to do that without making a splash and getting on the news. And violence has sort of become the methodology that folks are using to get their way or to get their voice heard.
You know, this leads me to a follow-up question. One of the one of the many goals of this project is to find places and people where kind of vulnerable conversations are happening, and
Right.
productive ones around this, because I think one of the major problems with gun discourse in America today is that most of it is largely taking place within echo chambers. And when those echo chambers sort of bump against one another, it's not really conversation, it's more of a shouting match.
Right.
And so what has been fascinating is that in some of I've interviewed some pastors anonymously, so far only ELCA pastors,
Okay.
and that anonymity, as far as I can tell, has created this interesting space where some of them are very much in favor. One of them is very much in favor of gun control, further gun control measures. Another is not certain, but he is himself a gun owner and owns guns for self-defense. But in
Right.
both of those cases, there was a kind of vulnerability that emerged, and a willingness to question, one's own thinking about
Right.
where one is at, that you don't typically see in public discourse spaces, because I think there's this pressure to kind of toe a particular line. And
Right.
so I wonder if you've encountered any spaces like that, where people are having genuine conversation about it.
What's interesting is there's something just happened yesterday, and it happened in the midst of social media. Yesterday was the 8th anniversary of the Virginia Tech shootings. And as an advocate for gun control, I often post things in social media about remembrances like that. And so I posted a remembrance on my Facebook page and on my Twitter about remembering that gun violence affects many persons, and that while a vast majority of Americans, when they're interviewed, say they favor stricter gun control, that we still haven't made substantive changes in our gun control policies. And a former student sent me a Facebook message and said, "Could we talk? I would really like to have a conversation about this." My son was on the campus that day. I have she was working at Virginia Tech at the time, lost a colleague. And she and I talked, and she is a gun advocate. She owns guns, but she's really in a difficult position where she feels like there are moments when she's nervous because of Virginia Tech and because of other shootings, and wants to carry a gun for protection. And she called and said, she inboxed me. We set up a time to talk. And she said, "It really bothered me that you posted that on Facebook, because it felt like you were saying you were anti-gun and no one should have access to those." And it feels like you're right. In many of these conversations, we're set into these boxes, very limited boxes, where if you say anything about gun control, you're automatically labeled as someone who says no one should have access to guns, which in no way did I imply or mean to imply. What most folks want to do is they want to once again get wedged into either end of the spectrum. You're either pro-gun and you think everybody ought to have access to every gun that's out there, or if you're for gun control, you're anti-gun. So often these things do become shouting matches and they become polarizing and very problematic conversations. What I found yesterday was a vulnerability in her to say, "I really want to hear what you mean when you say gun control." And so I explained a little bit more. She talked about her own sense of vulnerability and feeling like there were some places where she goes. And she's a pastor. She said, "There are places where I go that I'm all alone. I don't have my phone is out of connection. I'm out of service. I have a gun in my car, and I don't want someone to take that away from me. It's the place where I feel the least safe, and that gives me an element of safety." So those kind of moments, I think, have been really helpful to have these conversations. Sometimes when we're working with Heeding God's Call and some of the other groups that I work with, and we have roundtable conversations about guns and gun violence, I find it very interesting that who starts that conversation and how they position the room and sort of create safe space is a really important part of the process, Michael.
Yeah.
If somebody comes in and they say, we're of varying positions in this space, and wherever you are on this issue, it's a safe place for us to have that conversation. There are folks in the room that have been invited that I know are very much for gun control and are very clear in their own personal lives that they don't want to have access to guns or be around guns. And there are folks in this room for whom guns are a part of their everyday experience. And I want us to listen to each other and be open to the possibilities of dialogue and hear each other and honor the different perspectives. I've found some very wonderful conversation partners in those spaces. When someone comes in and they want to position themselves as the primary position of importance, when they privilege their experience over the experience of others, you set up a dialogue that's not healthy and not helpful. So absolutely, it's imperative that if we want to have these conversations, we have to honor the positions of others. We can't privilege our own experience or our own opinions over the experience of and opinions of others. And you can have some fabulous conversations, but you have to be open to those. Excuse me.
Yeah, and there's some level of risk involved, or willingness to say, by honoring, this person's opinion, I may open myself up to something new.
Yes, absolutely.
And then I think that is true of anyone from any position within this debate.
Right, right.
So you're trying to, I think, spark a conversation in a forthcoming collection of sermons. I'm sorry. I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about that project and what you're trying to do, what the research involves.
Okay. One of the things that I have been looking at in my own work in teaching students about preaching is how to address issues of crisis when they're in their congregations. How do we do crisis preaching, whatever that might deal with? And we look at preaching after 9/11, preaching after Sandy, preaching after some natural disasters, some man-made disasters, some violence. And naturally, over the last few years, one of the things that we've talked about, because it touches us more and more often, is preaching after gun violence. And one of the things I began talking with Dr. Day about was working on a project that would help pastors understand how they might address issues of gun violence in their own congregations. There's been studies done about how pastors addressed violence in their pulpits after 9/11. And there's been a little bit of research that's been done about how things were treated in the pulpit right after massive shootings like Sandy Hook. But I haven't seen really anything that helped pastors look at what a sermon might look like. So Dr. Day and I are talking about a project and working on the proposal and collecting sermons right now to do a preaching after gun violence book. And what we want to do is to sort of set the stage with some opening chapters that would look from Dr. Day's perspective at sort of the sociological and data-driven issues around gun violence. What's driving gun violence in the culture today? How is gun violence impacting us? And to do that work from a church and society perspective about God and guns, right? We also want to look at a pastoral care and pastoral theology perspective. Where does God come into the midst of this? How do we deal with these issues as pastors, as pastoral leaders, as congregational leaders? Then look at, sorry about that, at some liturgical issues, how we might shape a worship service that honors the different perspectives around guns, but also clearly honors and presents a perspective of theology of grace and compassion in the midst of mourning, and then looking at what it means to preach after these significant events. And so one of the things that I'm doing right now is the preaching perspective around this is I'm collecting sermons from around the country and from the last few decades that have addressed guns and looking at gun violence, particularly around mass shootings. I have collected sermons that were preached in the Columbine area right after the Columbine shootings. I've collected sermons from Washington State after the shootings this last year, in the Maryland area after the Navy shipyard shootings, and also sermons that were preached after Sandy Hook. We're also looking at gun violence in major urban areas like Chicago and Detroit, and asking pastors after significant gun shootings. There was a July a couple of years ago in Chicago where over 60 gun shootings occurred. And I'm talking to pastors in Chicago about sermons that they preached right after those weekends. So we're looking at sort of the culture of guns, the pastoral care issues around guns, the issue of preaching and how we can best address from the pulpit the crisis that occurs, the trauma that occurs in our communities when gun violence occurs, and looking at some specific sermons that have been preached after these events and trying to learn how can we best address these issues. Now, the interesting thing is the sermons that I've so far collected, all of these were pastors that were impacted within the geographic area by these gun violence episodes. I also want to turn in the later part of this book to what happens for the rest of us, right? I'm sitting in Iowa, and I hear about Sandy Hook, and my church has not been specifically impacted by what happened in Sandy Hook, but I certainly want to address the issues of gun violence, even though they haven't happened in my location. Then how does my sermon potentially get shaped and impacted and changed because of Sandy Hook, because of Columbine? So there's a number of different levels we're trying to address in this book, and we're in the collection and writing phase of this project.
So, Karyn, as you sift through these sermons, and by the way, this is such a fascinating project that you're doing. I'll look forward to reading it. Yeah. As you sift through those sermons, I mean, it must be just a treasure trove of theology. I mean, we're talking about issues of theodicy. We're talking about issues of society. We're talking about issues of how is God involved in violence, in human violence. You're talking about issues of will, and all of this stuff is kind of swirling around. So as you sift through those sermons, what are some of have you found some common strategies that are used by preachers to address these issues?
Yes. One of the things that I find very interesting in all of these sermons is laying a framework of relationship and finding a common ground in the beginning of these sermons. Every one of them tried to put themselves in a position where they honored the fact that there were people potentially sitting in their midst who were impacted by those events. You know, these were folks who were preaching in the communities where these events occurred. And nearly all of them were preaching in communities where someone had been killed who was a family member. And there were also folks in their communities who were first responders, who were on the scene in those instances. And there were also folks who may have known the perpetrators. Or known someone who might have been, who was a gun enthusiast. And so one of the things I found really interesting was in all of these situations, almost all, I've got to go back, but I think almost all of these situations, they honored the diversity of opinion early on in the sermon. Early on, they named the diversity of opinion, the diversity of vulnerable positions that might be in the community of faith, and wanted to honor that and name that, right? And I think that that sort of sharing of grief, that sharing of trauma, that sharing of we're all in different places about this, but I think we can all honor the loss, the tremendous sense of loss that has happened in our community. And wherever we are on the position, we can honor the fact that right now we come together to mourn and to try to make sense of this in a senseless situation, and to honor that we all come to this theologically from different perspectives as well. Some come in the room saying, where the hell was God? And some come in the room saying, isn't it reassuring that God was with them every moment that they were in that traumatic experience? And I find that finding common ground a really important piece. We talked about it in the dialogue question, how we have conversations about guns early on. And I found that many of these pastors were trying to find that same common space, that safe space to be in conversation about a really unsafe topic.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for thank you for sharing that response. Let's see. How many sermons will there finally be in?
I've got about 12 or 15 now that we're sifting through and looking at and evaluating. I think in the final analysis, there'll probably be about 6 to 8 in the book. And so some of those I will reference in the work that I do, the diversity of sermon perspectives that we have. Some of them really address the issue of theodicy and evil in a really healthy and helpful way. And there's a couple of the sermons that I've received that really they toe the line so carefully that they really don't posit a position. And I may share one of those. But I think in some of the communities, the pastor tried to walk that line so delicately that they never really came down and shared a perspective of where they thought God was. They were so in the framework or the mindset of trying to be too cautious that in the end, I don't think they ever really helped the congregation see where God was. So I'll probably
They kind of honor the relationship,
right.
But they never make a constructive
They
statement.
never made a constructive statement saying, this is where I think the church needs to be. This is where I believe God puts us. This is where our framework of theology as a United Methodist or a UCC or an ELCA or a Baptist congregation sort of puts us. And I want to create a space in this book that says, these are safe, constructive, healthy ways to posit a position, to make a constructive claim of who God is and who we are as a community of faith. So it's really interesting. Many of them start in this, let's create safe space, but they move then into, this is where I think we need to be, and this is where I think God challenges us. This is where our theology challenges us to say, no more. This is where our theology says, we can't, this is not all right. We have to challenge the systems. We have to challenge the culture that says gun violence and going in and shooting up a school that a good guy with a gun beats a bad guy with a gun every time, and all of our data shows that that's not accurate. But in some of these church contexts, folks want to say, I want to honor the Second Amendment so much that I don't want to position myself in a place that puts my pastorate at risk, right? When I was in seminary, my church and society professor was Tex Sample. I don't know if you know Tex Sample's work. He's a United Methodist church and society professor. And he taught a class jointly with Eugene Lowry, who was my preaching professor, about preaching and societal issues. And one day Tex said to our class, there are moments where you have to preach with your bags packed, where it is so imperative that you preach the gospel and make a constructive, healthy claim about what God wants for us, that this may be the moment that I get run out of town. And
hence the bags packed.
hence the
Ready
bags
to go.
packed. Yes. And so he said, you can't do that every week. There has to be a significant at-risk moment that you say, this is what I believe, this is what I believe the gospel claims, this is what I'm willing to stake my position on. And I teach my students, there are moments when you have to be willing to preach with your bags packed. Maybe that's about inclusive issues around LGBTQ. Maybe that's about the church getting outside of the four walls and really engaging missional ministry again. Maybe that's about gun violence. Maybe that's about some other issue for your congregation. But what is that moment where you're willing to preach with your bags packed? And for me, gun violence is that issue that I'm willing to preach with my bags packed and say those hard things. And some of the pastors in the sermons that I've collected really did preach with their bags packed. I mean, they were ready to take a hit if they had to. They were so moved by the violence that had impacted their community to say, enough is enough. We cannot allow this to happen. We have to call out this systems that allow illegal purchases, that allow massive cartridges to be sold, that allow automatic weapons to be sold. We have to call these to accountability. And some were not quite willing to be quite that bold in their preaching because of their context. And one of the things that I'm doing now is doing some follow-up conversations with those preachers about what led them to say what they did say. What are some of the things that they felt constrained in being able to say from the pulpit? What were some of the contextual issues that led them to make the decisions that they made? So that's the stage that I'm in right now, is doing some reflective conversations with those pastors.
Well, Reverend Dr. Karyn Wiseman, thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and is there a publication date yet on the
There's
book?
not. We're still working on it. We hope within 16-17 framework to get it out. But as soon as I know it, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll look forward to reading that.
Thank you.